Well, welcome everybody to the latest history and archaeology research seminar. And I'm going to introduce our guest speaker for this evening and explain a little bit about why she's so fab and interesting and why she's here. Because we have with us from the University of Leiden, via Sussex, as we've just learned, Femke Lippok. And Femke is currently a doctoral researcher at the University of Leiden, where she is employed on a sort of big project called which we're going to hear about, the Rural Riches Project, which is investigating a bottom-up approach to post-Roman Northwest Europe. And her remit is going to be looking at grave goods, or is looking at grave goods in the 5th to 7th centuries AD, CE, and looking at changes in that. But before that, she did her MA in archaeology at Leiden on cremation practices in the modern day Netherlands and neighbouring regions, and looking at the critiquing theoretical approaches to cremation and conducting a new analysis of the relationship of cremation with inhumation as well, not as opposites, as relationships in the variability of burial rites in the early Middle Ages. Now, Femke's already been published in the Journal of Archaeological Science, in World Archaeology, so you can check out her burgeoning publication venues as her work unfolds. And we're very excited to be able to talk to her at a point where she's, she's got some new things to tell us that are not in the publications, but also about, her interim ideas about her doctoral research. So if I can just read out the title, Changing Burial Rites and Rural Riches in Early Medieval Northern Gaul. Over to you, Femke.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I'm going to be sharing my screen now. Is that all right? Can everybody see the presentation?
Yeah, we can see that.
Super, thanks for the heads up. And I'll just make it go to where it needs to go. Yeah, so thanks for your introduction and thanks very much for allowing me to speak to you all. I'm very excited about it. So my presentation is about changing burial practices in Northern Gaul as part of a ritual economy. And as Howard has said already, my PhD is part of the Rural Riches Project, which is an ERC-funded project, which always needs to be said on the first slide. And before sharing some results of my ongoing PhD research, I'll take you through the setup of the presentation. So first, I'll give you a short introduction on where we are in time and space, going into part one about ritual economies and the Rural Riches Project, and continuing to a small overview of continental burials and the diversity in burials and burial places. And part three, I'd like to discuss about how we think about change and how we might change how we think about change. And finishing up with some concluding thoughts and future plans. Hopefully they'll be of interest to you. So the research area we'll be looking at is the Netherlands, Belgium, Northern France, and the German Rhineland, indicated in red here. And we'll be looking at the time period between 450 and 640. And at the time in the 5th century, this is an area where there's not a lot of people living here. So whole stretches of the research area are not showing any habitation. There's very few settlements and hardly any cemeteries at this time. And this, of course, could be due to a lack of our research skills or publications, or we're not able to date very precisely in this time period, but it's also one of the things that we hope to resolve with the Rural Riches Project. And here we are. This has, for the last 4.5 years, been our Rural Riches research group. And all of the project members have their very specific theme that they're working on, but within the same research area and time frame. And I won't be able to present the results of their research because there's simply not enough time. But obviously, we've tremendously helped and influenced each other throughout these last 4.5 years. And the premise of the Rural Riches Project started off with a bewilderment of the sheer amount and volume of objects coming from rural cemeteries and settlements. And these are not just any objects, they're very elaborately worked items, such as the bowl of Oesgeest here in the picture, which is a very interesting composite object from a Mediterranean-produced bowl with a decorative disc in the middle produced in the Rhineland, and handles that were probably produced in the UK. So an amazing object to start off with. We've also got glass beakers, like the one from Bergijk, which is a cemetery in the Netherlands, and many brooches, gold and silver brooches with garnet inlay that we can reliably show chemically that has been sourced in India. In other words, rural areas seem very well connected and able to procure goods from distant sources. And up to now, the driving forces of the economy after the fall of the Roman Empire were thought to be in different agents' hands. And some postulates the involvement of elites is what made the economy tick, and others emphasize long-distance trade, craftspeople, or merchants. But when you look at the sheer number of cemeteries in our research area, many of which have multiply richly endowed graves, we started to wonder if something was missing from this list of agents in bringing about an economic recovery. What was missing was the agency of rural people, who, after all, were the consumers of the goods that were exchanged. It's our hypothesis that it's the wealth circulating in rural ritual economies that made the world go round. Which brings us to the concept of ritual economies. Ritual economies deal with the interplay between social and cosmic relationships, and this concept made us ask questions about economic impacts of people's ritual behaviors. It's a generally accepted social fact that rituals have a central role in society in bringing people together and reaffirming shared values by acting in certain culturally prescribed ways. Some modern-day examples of rituals can be seen on this slide, and we've got very large-scale ones, like the reburial of Richard III, or a graduation ceremony in Leiden University. And in both, people are gathering together because of a shared idea of what's important in life. So academic achievement in terms of a graduation ceremony, or honoring a long-dead king and a long-lost king in terms of the reburial of Richard III. But rituals take on a smaller role as well. They're on a smaller scale as well. For example, one of my favorites in the top right, the German St. Martin procession, which celebrates a late Roman saint who split his cape in two on a freezing night to give it to a passerby who was freezing on the streets, and thereby saving this passerby from dying of the cold. To participate in the procession of St. Martin, kids have to make their own lanterns and proudly will show them off while walking through the town. An even smaller scale ritual is a Dutch birthday celebration, where you're expected to sit in a big circle with your entire family and drink coffee. And certain behavioral rules are in place. When you arrive, you're expected to kiss every single person in the room on their cheeks 3 times and congratulate them on their relative's birthday. So you would say to their mum, congrats on your son's birthday. And you'd say to their siblings, congrats on your brother's birthday, etc. And the value that's being affirmed here is communalism, as opposed to your birthday being your achievement. Family ties are emphasized. And rituals don't just facilitate social life, they also require investments in order to be organized and properly enjoyed. There are often unspoken rules as to what needs to be present at a ritual in order for it to be a success. Think, for example, of formal attire when you're at a graduation ceremony, and a Dutch birthday party wouldn't be the same without a birthday cake. And think about the German St. Martin procession without the lanterns that the kids have fashioned. It wouldn't be the same procession. You can imagine that rituals, such as sacrifices to ancestors, have material components that need to be produced and exchanged in order to be used in these rituals. The same goes for things like house building rituals, fertility rituals, and most importantly, for the point that I'm making here, funerals. All of these provide work, affirm social connections, and stimulate local economies. So as carvers put it, some ideologies and values behind rituals require depositions of objects in graves, and others require wealth to be donated to churches to safeguard the soul. Which brings us back to the central question of my PhD, namely, how did burial rites change for rural people, and what does that mean for the ritual economies? And the overarching question of the Rural Riches project being, what role did the mass of the rural population play in the post-Roman economic development of Northwestern Europe? To properly go into the changing burial rites, I first have to introduce continental early medieval burials. There are different burial traditions at the time in this area, and they're generally ascribed to 3 regions. So we've got Northern Germany and the Netherlands, we've got Northern Gaul and Southern Germany. And today we'll be focusing on Northern Gaul, the big red blob right there. Typically, you'll hear that early medieval graves are found on so-called row grave cemeteries. This is a very debated term, as in the past a lot of emphasis was put on furnished inhumation and how they were found in neat rows on extensive cemeteries, resulting in this idea of a row grave cemetery. But this focus on the furnished inhumation negates the many other forms of burial and thereby restricts our understanding of the complete ritual repertoire of early medieval communities. And in the next slides, I will show you some of the variety of burial forms that are practiced at the time. First of all, there's a huge variability in sizes of cemeteries. So we've got very small cemeteries of between 1 and 30 graves, sometimes also singular graves, which are increasingly found now on settlements as well. We've got larger cemeteries of hundreds of graves and some enormous ones of several thousands of graves. And here is an overview of the sizes of cemeteries in the research area. And it seems that larger cemeteries are more numerous in the southern part of the research area and along the rivers in the German Rhineland. And seeing how dense the spread of cemeteries is in some places, it brings up the question of the significance of the choice of location of some cemeteries. We have indications that not all members of one settlement ended up in the same cemetery. For example, in Niederlei in France, after DNA analysis, it was concluded that out of the 32 people buried there, only 2 could be shown to be related. And there were some indications that none of the children found buried there had any relations to any of the adults. So this indicates that people chose to bury their dead in specific locations, and it's fascinating to think about what might have been the significance, meaning, or reason for them burying their dead in that location. The place of interment may have been a deliberate choice in pursuit of different strategies of remembrance. And that's what we see in other choices of locations as well. At the settlement of Oesgeest here, for example, we find human, horse, and dog burials. This is also the site where that beautiful bowl that I showed in the beginning came from. So we see the layout of the settlement with the red squares symbolizing the houses on, and they're arranged on 4 islands that you can see in yellow. And these islands were connected via bridges spanning narrow waterways. And the settlement was also flanked by the River Rhine here on the left side of the settlement. So most human burials were found at the outskirts of the settlement, like in the northern bit of the settlement, along one of the waterways. And the exception was a burial of a young girl. Most of the graves here were of adults, but one young girl was found a little bit closer to one of the houses, as well as one cremation that was placed in the top fill of a water well. As you can imagine, there's not enough burials here to represent the entire population of the settlements, which is another indication that people chose to bury some of the dead in very specific locations. We have some suspicions that the cemetery of Rijnsburg, which is very close by to this cemetery, would be the place that other people from Oegstgeest were buried at. Other special locations, we find burials at our inside Roman villae, and Iron Age and Bronze Age cemeteries are often revisited in the early Middle Ages too, to bury some of the dead. This obviously brings out fascinating questions about how people viewed the past in the past. Going back to ruins of Roman villae or areas associated with ancient cemeteries must have been, quite something. Recently, Dr. Rika Anar discovered that they not only revisit ancient cemeteries, they also reuse urns that they find there. We know this because of a Bronze Age urn that was found on the Bronze Age cemetery containing cremated remains that were radiocarbon dated to the early Middle Ages. Most graves are inhumations, and here we can see some of the variability and what they look like in the field. So most often, in the Netherlands at least, you'll find things like in Veldhoven on the left side of the picture. So these are wooden coffin graves, and in this case it's a chamber grave even. And what you can see is that the wood is decomposed but leaves real clear lines of where the structure of the coffin would have been. And what I love about this picture, I got to excavate this site myself. And what you can see in the cross section of the grave, a sort of dark line going across. I hope you can see my mouse. And that is the lid of the coffin that has collapsed after a while under the pressure of the topsoil, making lots of sand spill into the coffin. And I just love that you're able to see that in this case. Other examples of inhumations are stone-built graves, such as at Indian Piers here, a grave made of Roman spolia, and although it doesn't compare to Sutton Hoo at all, our very own ship burial at Den Haag Zolleveld, which we're very proud of. For inhumations, there's an array of body positions. Most usual are skeletons that are found on their back, but crouch burials or burials that are found prone also occur. And here are two examples on the right-hand side of the slide from Mengen of a crouch burial and a person who was found prone with their hands bound on their back. Sometimes we also find skeletons that seem to have been nailed to the coffin, making all kinds of amazing stories appear, of course. Another fascinating part of the burial ritual are secondary burials. And it's now widely accepted that early medieval people would return to graves to reopen them, not just to take objects or bones out, but also to deposit them. An example of this is what we see here on the slide, the other burial that I haven't talked about here in red. This is a grave from the Roman villa of Borgharen, where a woman was found with two boys at her feet. And the bones of the woman's feet were disturbed, which tells us that at some time passed between her interment and the secondary deposition of the boys. DNA analysis was done in this case and showed that at least one of the boys was related to the woman, suggesting that it was important that these family members be reunited after death. Another reopening case study has us return to the settlement of Oegstgeest, where the bones of 6 adult men were arranged in a star form. Completely amazing. The bones did not show any signs of cutting and were probably lifted from graves in the vicinity of the settlement. This illustrates that people took bones from graves as easily as they deposited them, making reopenings a two-way process. There's also the famous grave of St. Cuthbert in Durham, where there's signs that this grave was reopened several times over the centuries to deposit bones of other people or even objects, as is evident by 9th century ropes and 11th century comb found in the 7th century grave. Next to secondary burials, multiple burials occur as well, and the difference with secondary burials is that these people were buried at the same time. This is an example of 5 men being buried at the same time in Großhöping, and after they were buried their graves was covered by a big mound. Already mentioned a couple of times, next to inhumation, cremation occurs. So this is a form of burial that has been neglected for a long time for a host of reasons, which Howard has published on extensively, and I won't get into now. But in some ways, I find it's understandable that some of these graves were overlooked, especially as you can see here in a picture, if a cremation grave doesn't have an urn around it and only a few grams of bone were deposited, one can imagine that they're easily overlooked. However, it is important not to let that stop us from considering these burials just as much a part of people's burial repertoires, because we can see them frequently co-occurring with inhumations, as you can see here in Elst, Lunen, and Lent, which indicates that both forms of burial were important in people's strategies of remembrance. And just to illustrate that you need to look for cremations in order to find them, is this article I wrote with Alex Branse using his brilliant search engine, which allowed us to shift through thousands of grey literature reports on Dutch archaeology. 23 early medieval cremation graves in blue were added in this way to our data set, indicating that cremation was far more common than previously thought, and which goes against the normal narrative about burial practices at the time. As previously stated, graves on these cemeteries are lavishly endowed with all sorts of objects. Brooches were mentioned earlier, but there's much more, including all kinds of weapons, different types of jewelry, glass, ceramic, and wooden vessels, and all kinds of tools and amulets as well. And it's important to note that in early medieval graves, there's this idea that there's a strong gender representation theme. So it's assumed that men's graves often contained weapons and female graves contained jewelry. Due to bad bone preservation and old excavations without reliable osteoanalysis, we're often not able to verify whether the gender expression matches the individual sex. Some studies suggest that there's a 90% accuracy in saying a jewelry grave is indeed a female or is a female skeleton, but even then there's a suspicion that the osteological assessment may not have been impartial, because knowing that a grave has jewelry in it might affect the assessment of the sex of the individual. But with that as a sort of warning in the back of our minds, we can turn to part 3 of this presentation, which is about change. And I've chosen this rather dramatic image to illustrate a point, namely that change has for a long time been conceptualized as the result of sudden events. This old conceptualization of change entails that people continue doing the same things unless an intrusive factor comes along to stir up society and entice change. Intrusive factors are often a new religion, such as Christianity, a new people entering an area and bringing with them their own practices, such as the whole migration period, or, for example, elites that decide society needs to change and consequently lead by example, illustrated by the baptism of Clovis, enticing many to follow in his footsteps. There are many reasons why this ad hoc idea of change persists. There's the way that we date material in phases, which we'll talk about in a moment, but also early medieval archaeology is often guided by historical events that a priori guide our interpretations of archaeology. The texts tell us a lot about elites, so we conclude that they must have been the enticers of change. When it comes to burial practices, the idea that elite lead by example seems to be prevalent on the continent. In many of the 6th century theories of change in burial practices, elites are assumed to lead by example. The argument sees local people adhering to royal or ducal families whose traditions they adopt to obtain protection under their laws. But this completely negates the agency of the rural people. Not only does it assume that elites are present everywhere, it also ascribes them the power to intervene in the rural population's burial rites. I find it hard to believe that when an outsider, however well connected and wealthy, comes into an area, people would just let go of their burial customs they've been practicing to get into the good graces of this new elite person. Instead, we might consider an alternative view of change, already vocalized by many, but most recently by Gavin Lucas and Rachel Crellin. They propose that instead of this ad hoc view of change, change is more gradual and happens constantly through everyday actions and repetition, and also through rites, burial rites. Which brings us to a challenging question, namely, how do we research change archaeologically? As archaeologists, we are still mainly dependent on typochronologies to date our contexts. This inevitably leads to these types of schedules, as you see on the image, of time phases with associated material culture. The nature of our tools forces us to still use this box-like view of time, but I will hopefully show how we can tell more gradual stories of change based on burial data. In my research area, we are fortunate enough to be able to date graves to phases of approximately 40 years each. And in my PhD, I'm considering graves from the period 450-600 from 16 cemeteries in the research area. And here you can see like the spread of the case studies all throughout the research area. What I want to present today are some first results with data from those 16 sites. I briefly mentioned gender-associated objects in early medieval graves, and although contested, we'll rely on the general assumption that jewelry graves represent female-gendered graves and weapons represent male-gendered graves. With a warning in the back of our minds that gender associations are not completely reliable indicators of sex, I'd like to turn to these weapon and jewelry graves. Here we see an overview of how many graves per time phase contain weapons or jewelry. First, we'll look at the weapon burials to the left and in blue. And what we can see is that at the start of the research period, a lower percentage of graves contains weapons than at a later phase. When we go into more detail, we can see a change in what types of weapons are deposited most frequently. Different lines on this graph, different colored lines, represent different types of weapons, and they fluctuate throughout time, depending on how high the percentage of weapon burials is that contain this weapon. So the most obvious change is from a predominant axe burial in orange to a predominant lance burial, whereas graves containing swords remain steady throughout the ages at around 10%. So how do we interpret this change? As others have argued before me, some weapons are multi-interpretable tools. Axes can just as well be associated with the cutting of wood and clearing of land, whereas spears and arrows are frequently used to symbolize the hunt. Many books have been written on symbolism of the hunt in late Roman and early medieval times. Those narrators argue that hunting expresses dominion over a certain area. You can only hunt where you are in charge. So perhaps what we're seeing is a shift from emphasizing the importance of clearing of the land in the first part of the research period to hunting and expressing dominion of the cleared land in the later part of the research period. When we turn to jewelry graves, we see the opposite of what happened with weapon burials. The percentage of jewelry graves actually goes down as time progresses. When we look in more detail, the composition of jewelry graves also changes. Where brooches were quite frequent and often present in early graves, they're far less frequent in later graves. See the black line. At the same time, bead necklaces in green show an opposite trend, being far more popular at the end of the period than at the beginning. Not only are brooch graves less frequent in later periods, the average number of brooches in them also goes down. As you can see, the yellow line and the red line represent graves containing 3 and 4 brooches respectively. And in the last period, MA3, dating to around 570-610, the percentage of brooch graves containing 3 or 4 brooches goes right down, whereas the percentage of graves containing 1 or 2 brooches goes up. So if we take brooches as a proxy, the later jewelry graves seem less elaborate than the earlier ones. Putting both of these trends together gives us some perspective. We can see that percentage of jewelry graves goes down when the percentage of weapon graves actually goes up. See, the blue line is kind of increasing and the green line is decreasing. So it seems that where female gender expression was very much emphasized in the late 5th and early 6th century, this changed in the late 6th century. But why? One early medieval law text, the Lex Salica, gives us insight into some of the life stages of women at the time. The text declares different fines for crimes against certain types of persons. From this, we can take that the categories they mention are of some significance in this society. And the categories women are divided into very often have a relation with fertility. So we're looking at a pregnant woman, women who've just born a child, women after childbearing. All of these are categories that are considered as significantly different because the price of crimes against these persons differs as well. Irene Barbiera and Cristina La Rocca argue for the important role of women, not just as reproducing society, but as important social connectors between families. At a time when people are scarce and the land is quite empty, you would very much be dependent on other families to live. The role of women as connectors between families through marriage must have been invaluable. But after 100 years or so, we can see that the area cemeteries reflect a larger population, and one can assume that connections between families were solidly in place. The role of women as expressed in the burial changed. It's fascinating that at a time when female gender becomes de-emphasized in graves, the number of women's religious houses goes up. This table shows in green the increasing number of newly established women's religious houses in France and Belgium at the time when our jewelry graves actually go down. Guy also suggests that at the end of the 6th century, under the influence of Christianity, chastity becomes an important value in the gender expression of women. And this might be one of the developments that we can see in changing burial rites. So, to conclude, due to the massive amounts of objects deposited in rural burials, the agency of rural people in bringing about an economic recovery in the early Middle Ages should not be overlooked. There's a huge variability in burial forms in the early Middle Ages, all of which need to be taken into account if we are to understand the development of ritual behaviors. And from the detailed analysis of changing burial rites, it seems gender expression changed from the mid-5th to late 6th century. There's still a lot to do. For example, this is a different part of my PhD. I'm going to analyze object combinations and where they are placed in the grave. As we see here, the example of Brochem done by Rika and Naert, where you can see for weapon burials how not only the composition of these burials changed in the first period all the way to the left, we see a lot of axes, whereas in the second and third phases they're far less frequent, and we see that shields don't occur in the first phases, but in later phases they do. And if you look at these graves and not only look at what objects are found in them, but in what combinations they're found and where they occur in the grave, we might be able to trace communities of ritual practice. So people who not only share material culture, but also share an idea of what needs to be done with this material culture, what it should be put in the grave with in combination with what other objects, and also where it should be put in the grave. It will be so fascinating to see if these ritual practices change over time, and if they change in different cemeteries at the same time, because that could indicate some idea of how ideas of burial rites are spread and how quickly they spread. As a first attempt, we can see a comparison of weapon burials at Muiden and Verlaine-Oudemont. They show very different practices of placement. So some material culture is employed, but the placement of these weapons is completely different at Muiden, which is the lower bit of the screen, than at Verlaine-Oudemont. We see at Muiden that all the graves are placed behind the head of the deceased, whereas in Verlaine-Oudemont, they are much more occurring over at the grave and more as a sort of as if they are in use. So axes are often placed near the hand and swords are placed in the elbow of the deceased. But more on that type of research at a later stage of my research. And before I round up, I just quickly would like your attention for the launch of our Rural Riches database, which will become accessible to the general public and researchers on the 9th of December. So the database is full of cemeteries, settlements, stray finds, and historical attestation from the 5th to 7th centuries. And if you'd love to have a rummage through from the 9th of December onwards, you can. There will be an official launch with a couple of talks, which you can participate in if you want to. Here's the link. So you can find the link on Twitter a little bit later, or you can take a picture with your photographic memory and have it like that. And with that said, I would like to thank you very much for your attention. It was so lovely to speak to you, and I look forward to your questions.